All right, we are on. So hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of Anti-Semitism, Past, Present, and Future. Again, I want to thank the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies, and I'm representing the Yukon Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, and Joel Messing and Regina Miller of the Graduate School of Adult Education. We need a name for this fantastic entity that many of you have taken these classes with now from the original context group. So we're very much looking forward to part two of our series on anti-Semitism in the medieval period. Thank you so much to Dina Grant for starting us off last week with a wonderful session on the Bible and early Christianity and a discussion of anti-Judaism, which was a fascinating way to begin this class. Next week, I will offer the third session on anti-Semitism in the modern period. And I think we'll see that there's some really interesting through lines that the three of us will be discussing together on Monday, November 9th at the concluding session on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism, which will be offered in conjunction with Kristallnacht on Monday, November 9th. I have two announcements before I turn it over to Regina. One is that this Wednesday evening, the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies and the Yukon Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life are co-sponsoring a lecture by Beryl Lang, who many of you may know, a longtime professor at Wesleyan University and emeritus professor from SUNY and various other institutions. He'll be offering a lecture that's titled Against the Lachrymose View of Jewish History Again. I will send an email with the registration information for those of you who might be interested. As you'll see, I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about in terms of how we view and understand and interpret anti-Semitism within Jewish history. And the other point that I wanted to mention, and Marshall also sent me an interesting article in this regard. We noticed that this week, the United States State Department has organized a conference on online anti-Semitism. And I think this has been organized in conjunction with Israel's Foreign Ministry and with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So this conference is taking place this Wednesday and Thursday, the 21st and 22nd. And it's a two-day conference, and I will send the schedule for that conference to all of you. I think it's going to be streaming online, so it might be interesting if you have time to drop in and see what they're talking about in terms of the proliferation of online anti-Semitism in the world today, which I think will connect to some of the things that I'm talking about next week. So I will send those two things in an email out to the class. And those are my two announcements. And now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Regina Miller, Interim Director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford.
Thank you very much. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jonathan Elukin, who is a professor at Trinity College. He teaches courses in medieval history, Jewish studies, historiography, and the history of the book. He's particularly interested in Jewish-Christian relations, the evolution of the Bible, the history of reading practices, philosophies of history, and various aspects of medieval society, including the Crusades, chivalry, English law and government, and the meaning of the Middle Ages for contemporary culture. So I thought, gee, I haven't seen a list of everything that Jonathan has written and done. And I know about his book, Living Together, Living Apart, Rethinking Jewish-Christian Relations in the Middle Ages, which I recommend to all of you. But I found this very interesting article in European Judaism entitled Shylock, the Devil, and the Meaning of Deception in the Merchant of Venice. And I just share that title with you just to show you the diversity of Jonathan Elukin's interests and writing. And I know that we will learn a lot from him tonight. So, Jonathan, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and particularly want to thank Avi for hosting this, although in some ways it's more like Avi tells me what to do and I do it, and this is just another example of that, which is fine. Most of the time they're really good things to do. And also to thank Regina for her very kind words. Somewhere my mom is watching this, and I mean, metaphorically, and I'm sure she's appreciating it. And also to thank Regina and Joel for their organization of the graduate school program in which I've taught. And I think that really Jewish education, serious Jewish education for adults, depends on community people being engaged and making the effort to put these programs together. And certainly Regina and Joel are two of the leaders of that effort. So I'm grateful to them. I will be very low tech tonight. I'm not sharing any images. I'm not sharing any screens. So I'm just going to talk for a little while, and then you guys, we can ask questions and have a conversation. I will say that I've been told by my students over the past semester and a half on Zoom that because I'm trying desperately to make eye contact in this imaginary constructed world, they say that I end up kind of looking like a possessed person because I'm sort of staring so intently at the screen. And also that I tend to raise my voice over the course of the lecture because you keep trying to think, well, if I just speak louder, then I'll definitely connect with people. So if at some point I start to have crazy eyes and to start screaming at you, please wave your hands and I'll try to bring it down a notch. But we're on Zoom and we have to kind of struggle through this. So what I'd like to do tonight is, in a way, trace the evolution of my thought about anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. And I'm grateful to Avi and Regina and Joel, particularly for this opportunity to talk about this with you, because it gave me an opportunity to rethink some things. I started off in one place that I was fairly sure I understood what I thought about this topic. And because of some recent reading and thinking, I'm now at a place where I'm not sure what I think about this topic, which may be unsatisfying for you, but intellectually is, frustrating for me too. But I think, therapeutically, as kind of intellectual therapy, it's a good thing to have done. So the starting point, the starting question is, was there anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages? Really, that means, I think, was there anti-Semitism in the pre-modern world? Or, in another way of saying it, has there always been anti-Semitism before the Holocaust? And the implied connection at the end, the implied sort of afterword there, would be that by implication, does this long-term perennial anti-Semitism lay the groundwork or culminate in the Holocaust? Now, as a starting point, there's a lot to break apart there before we can even begin to answer that question. We have to begin to ask a new sort of range of questions as well now about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the modern world. Has it survived from the pre-modern world? Has it been shaped, influenced by the Holocaust? What is the contemporary, what's the nature of contemporary anti-Semitism, Muslim, far right, et cetera? But those are questions about sort of anti-Semitism in the contemporary world that I'll leave to Avi to talk about. But this central question, this starting point, was there anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, and that accompanying sort of underlying meaning that was there anti-Semitism in the pre-modern world? Was there always anti-Semitism before the Holocaust? And did that anti-Semitism culminate in the Holocaust? That's going to be our starting point and our initial question. But before we can answer that question, we have to ask, in a very Jewish way, some questions about the question. The first one is, what is anti-Semitism? There are myriad competing definitions of anti-Semitism, which we don't have time to go through tonight. Certainly, one of the aspects of anti-Semitism, or what people argue is anti-Semitism, is the racial understanding or the racial characterization of the Jews as a distinct racial or ethnic population. And that, as Avi, I think, will probably talk about more with us next time, is a product of the 19th century. So the racial understanding of anti-Semitism is not a medieval term. It is not a medieval idea. It's a term that comes out of 19th century politics, 19th century ideas about the Jews. And we'll certainly hear more about that from Avi next week. But the challenge for us then is, when we're trying to understand the medieval world, can we apply a 19th and 20th century term that is preoccupied with the question of race to a society for which the idea of race is fundamentally foreign in some ways, and which did never used that term, right? It did not exist in the medieval past. So then we come to another question, and this is why in an ideal world I would have had a blackboard so I could sort of do a flow chart, that from a tree, a kind of thinking tree from each of these questions. So then we want to define or talk about what is anti-Semitism. But the term itself is impossible by its very nature to apply productively to the Middle Ages. Then how are we going to talk about and understand anti-Jewish feeling, or the expression of anti-Jewish thinking or feeling or actions, in a pre-modern society that is at least before the 19th century and maybe even several centuries before that? And what scholars have done as a kind of default, or as a backup plan, plan B, is to describe the actions or thought of Christians about Jews that are negative in some sense under the rubric of anti-Judaism, okay? Anti-Judaism itself is a profoundly problematic term to use in the context of trying to understand all of the expressions of negative ideas about the Jews in a medieval context. I could go into detail about that, but we would be here all night. So what I would suggest is that I would be happy to, Avi could, or I could, send along a piece that I've written that will appear in a volume from the University of Toronto. They have a volume called Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism. And my little essay is on the term anti-Judaism. And in that essay, more or less, I make the case, I don't know whether successfully, but I try to make the case, that as problematic as anti-Semitism is as a term to describe the negative feelings and thought and actions towards Jews in the ancient, late antique, medieval, and early modern world, anti-Semitism is equally problematic because it distorts the Jewish experience, it distorts Jewish identity, it distorts Christianity and the Christian experience, and it is not a useful or productive term. And as I said, just have to go with me on that for tonight, and certainly happy to forward that essay to people so that they can follow up on that. So where does that leave us then? It basically leaves us unable, I think, at least with the terminology that we have at our disposal now, to communicate effectively or productively about what happened to the Jews or how Christians thought about the Jews in the pre-modern world. if we go to the ancient and medieval world, then how can we characterize this anti-Jewish expression? How do we analyze it? How do we assess it? How do we measure it? How do we calibrate it? How do we try and understand it? It's simply not acceptable to give up, to say, we can't use anti-Semitism, we can't use anti-Judaism, therefore we just ignore it. There are, I think, some ways to do that, but I think it's most beneficial to start from trying to collect information about the reality of the pre-modern experience between Christians and Jews, and then to build out from that a category or a way of thinking about it, rather than to import in these terms that are so problematic, like anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. So just briefly then, what are some of the tropes or examples of Christian-Jewish interaction that appear in, let's say, the late antique and medieval world that are characterized by some negative aspect? And I'm sure that many of you could add to this list. And in an ideal world, in an ideal classroom, I go around the table and ask people to contribute different pieces of evidence, and we build together on the board, you know, a kind of running list of these things. But since this is a fallen world where we live on Zoom, I'm just going to do that as well. But you know, feel as if you're participating in this. And if I forget something, or you know, there's something you'd like to add, you know, Avi can stage manage this. Certainly, we can collect a list of these tropes about the Jews that are probably familiar to many of you. The association of the Jew with the devil in some ways, right? And Regina was kind enough to mention my article on Shylock. That makes her the second or third person who's actually ever noticed the article on Shylock. But certainly the association of Shylock with the devil is very powerful in the play, if you haven't read it recently. And that certainly comes out of a medieval tradition of association with the devil. The Jew as moneylender, obviously, again, culminating, if you will, in the Shylock stereotype, or Fagin even later. But the real sense that the Jew is, you know, manipulating money, involved with money, benefiting from the suffering of Christians in economic terms. The accusations that go under the rough title of blood libel, where Jews are thought to use Christian blood, often acquired from murdering Christian children for various ritual purposes. The accusation or suspicion that Jews around the plague in 1348 poisoned the wells and contributed to the propagation of the plague and the disease around in 1348. The deicide itself, that is the Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion, the rejection of Jesus, if you will, perhaps the corruption of the Old Testament to in some corners, although you know, traditional Christianity, as we'll see, you know, has a very positive vision of Jewish custodianship, if you will, of the Bible. But we have a whole range of attitudes towards the Jews that come from, you know, a very wide chronological range and a very broad geographical range that make up this anti-Jewish list, if you will, that we can see. So this list does suggest, and I'm leaving out probably many other aspects or many other accusations or criticisms of the Jews, but this list does suggest that there is some kind of recurring negative thought about the Jews in the Middle Ages, or at least from, you know, the onset of Christianity through the Middle Ages. And there's no denying that. These were real thoughts. The accusations were real. You cannot explain this away. You cannot ignore them, okay? But if you look at the reality of Jewish life in the Middle Ages, this list becomes very problematic as a way to gauge and shape our understanding of the medieval past. It is very easy to take that list and say, yes, a kind of permanent, resilient, recurring, expansive, fluid, anti-Jewish mania existed in Christian culture, okay? But if you look at the reality of Jewish life in the Middle Ages, it becomes impossible, I think, to make that argument, or to make that argument without so many caveats and so many provisos and so many distinctions that the force of that argument is changed profoundly. The main point is, of course, the survival of the Jews, right? That is, if this feeling about the Jews that is expressed in these various ways, the devil, money lending, the blood libel, etc., if that mania was so encompassing, so permanent, so powerful, how did the Jewish community or Jewish communities survive medieval Europe? It just does not make sense then to see those actions or thoughts as controlling, as defining, and as shaping the totality of the Jewish experience or their interactions with Christians. And I can cite a whole slew of other factors about medieval life that equally complicate our acceptance of this traditional list. Regina, again, was very kind to point people towards my book where I go through this. And just very, very quickly, one can point to the really profound evidence that we have of peaceful Jewish-Christian interaction in mercantile situations, in social situations, personal friendships, etc. We can point to the acculturation of Jews in Christian culture, the assumption of Christian patterns of thought, of art, of dress, of language, so that, again, if that mania was there as the controlling factor of Christian-Jewish dynamics, it's very hard to understand how Christians and Jews in many places in Europe navigated this world to create these social and intellectual bonds that they clearly did, okay? Again, there's been a growing body of evidence to support this argument. Beryl's talk on Wednesday is a kind of allusion to the reaction against this lachrymose view, against this view of Jewish history just as persecution and suffering. And some of the work that's been done by me, by others, recently there's been some really interesting work on the Jews of Austria and medieval Austria and how deeply embedded they were into the local economies of these towns, how they went to, Christians came to their weddings, how there was a kind of, a real sort of communal identity for the Jews in these Austrian towns. All of those things suggest that there is no easy answer to this very, very frustrating, if you will, this very perplexing conflict between the two stories that we could tell about the medieval Jewish experience. We could tell the story, if we just look at the list of tropes and animus against the Jews, as one of persecution, suffering, and animus towards the Jews that roughly goes under the term of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. But equally, we can tell a story about Jewish resilience, Jewish acculturation, Jewish interaction with Christians, and a space for the development of Jewish communities to thrive culturally over the course of the medieval and early modern periods. Okay. What story do we tell? What story do we tell? I initially wanted to tell the story of the positive side of this. That is, my little book and subsequent work has been about opposition to this lachrymose vision of history that is remarkably resilient in both general Jewish historiography, narratives about Jewish history, as well as Christian historiography about the Jews. That in and of itself is a very interesting subject. Why is this lachrymose persecutorial vision of Jewish history, particularly in the Middle Ages, so resilient? I mean, okay, you didn't read my book, that's totally fine, but there are lots of other people now who are talking about this stuff. And yet when you bring together in these synthetic works of history a vision of the Jewish past in the Middle Ages, 99% of the time, you get this traditional negative listing of the tropes that constitute what people thought was anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. And again, that's the topic for another discussion. But in the course of preparing for this talk, I'm not shifting my position in a way, but I'm struggling with the need to integrate these two stories in a way that I hadn't thought was necessary, or that I didn't think reflected some kind of reality. Now, I did do that, and I do think, you know, any responsible historian obviously occupies this gray area. So in the book and in other places, I've always said that, you know, I have no problem imagining a Jewish past in the Middle Ages where, you know, you can have both security and anxiety. You can have both persecution and safety. It depends on where you lived. It depends on the time of the year. It depends on the Jewish community. It depends on the Christian community. Very much similar, you know, not that I know this firsthand, but I imagine similar in some ways to the Jim Crow South. Probably a lot safer than the Jim Crow South, but still similar in that sense, where in a larger context of instability, suspicion, maybe some kind of outright violence, you could have, you know, human connections, moments of safety, ability to flourish culturally, etc. That's one way of resolving the conflict between these two stories. But I'm increasingly dissatisfied with that because I think that the historical aftershocks of what we see in these bursts or flashes of persecution and animus toward the Jews have such a powerful and evocative afterlife that I think we have to think about the medieval past somewhat much longer story of anti-Semitism. So that's what I'd like to turn to now, which forces me to ask some more questions, okay? So I haven't answered any questions. You can complain about that in the course evaluations, or that's what I tell the students. I haven't answered any questions, but I can pose some additional questions that I think you know, might be useful to think about. So related questions, even once we understand this complicated reality of medieval life. How do we determine, or how would we determine, a critical level of anti-Semitism, you know, in any society, in any geographical or social group? I mean, what is a critical or dangerous level of anti-Semitism, right? How do we calibrate for that? How do we measure that? Another question, when does this anti-Jewish sentiment become significant in the medieval world, let's say, for example, to other prejudices in medieval Europe, of which it was filled, as any society is, right? The English hated the Irish, the English hated the French hated the English, everybody hated the Germans. They didn't really like the Italians too much. They really, really hated the Muslims. I mean, just pick your choice of, religious, ethnic, national, or proto-national. The peasants hated the lords hated the peasants. I mean, you can just make this list of violence and prejudice go on forever, virtually in any society, but certainly in the medieval society. Did Christian attitudes towards Jews stand out in any sense from this larger array of prejudices and suspicion? When does it become a pattern? When does it become permanent, if it ever does become permanent? How do we understand its transmission through space and time in the late antique and medieval world, right? How do we measure or track it? Is there a break? Is there a kind of revolutionary moment when this anti-Jewish mania or this anti-Jewish DNA changes, mutates into something profoundly different than what went before? And here I would just allude to another great book that's just come out by Magda Teter, T-E-T-E-R, called The Blood Libel, or just Blood Libel, where she makes the case that the real impact of the stories about Jewish ritual abuses and murdering children, et cetera, all these unpleasant things, really embeds itself into the European mind after printing, so in the second half of the 15th century, because all of these stories that had been recounted orally or had kind of fragmentary evidence for them, now in the world of printing are built up and solidified and made permanent in the books that are printed en masse and distributed throughout Europe. In many ways, she's extending an argument or applying to this Jewish situation an argument by Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's the great historian of the book from the University of Michigan, who made a very similar case, actually an identical case, for profound changes in European society, like the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution. So that, not that revolutions didn't happen before printing. Obviously, Christianity arose and people converted to Christianity before printing. But certain other kinds of changes, heretical movements, let's say in the 13th and 14th century, kind of petered out because the church or officials could find the books and burn them, or they could destroy them, or they just couldn't produce enough of the books to get any kind of traction in these societies. But once you have the printing press, around the middle of the 15th century, then somebody like Luther, all of that Reformation criticism of the Catholic Church is now a permanent, or soon to be a permanent, part of European culture. They can't destroy the pamphlets. They can't destroy Erasmus. They can't destroy, the various other commentaries and objections and criticisms of the church. Okay, and the same argument, Eisenstein says, applies to things like the Renaissance, where before the Renaissance, that is, of the 14th and 15th century, there had been periodic rediscoveries of Latin and Greek in medieval culture, but it never sort of took over the culture in the same way that happens in the 14th and then later in the 15th century. Because the printing press creates this pan-European community, this pan-European intellectual community where everybody is engaged with translating and commenting on Latin and Greek works. So the Renaissance exists. The Renaissance has traction in the society. And the same thing is true, Eisenstein says, about the scientific revolution. I won't go through all the details, but Galileo and others, they can communicate with their scientific interlocutors, across their partners, across the world. They can modify experimental information sequentially, that they can add to and grow data in a way that they couldn't before. And they can visually represent data, pictures of flora and fauna, maps, etc., in a way that they hadn't been able to do before. So Eisenstein's argument about the revolutionary power of print to embed these changes in European society is very, very powerful, and I think very compelling. When Magda takes this and applies it to the blood libel, it just makes sense. I mean, I haven't read all the book, but it just makes sense, right? So that, for the first time in the 15th and 16th centuries, there's no escape valve for this kind of these violent images about the Jews, right? The manuscripts don't disappear. They're not lost or buried in monasteries. An accusation that happens in Trier or one corner of Germany or one quarter of Europe doesn't just stay there. Once you get this stuff churning through presses and volumes about the Jews, like Eisenmenger and other kinds of collections, then everybody in Europe can now see it, everybody can know about it, okay? So do we then say that we have to wait for a technological change to see the impact of this kind of mania and anti-Jewish sentiment? And if so, is printing the only time that it happens? Or are there successive technological changes about mass media, mass education, et cetera, that also could influence and shape the intensity and resilience of these visions or images about the Jews that we come to say are anti-Semitic? How do we even measure or change? How do we even measure the changes in medieval society itself and the impact that those changes have on attitudes towards the Jews? Because significantly, the Middle Ages is not static. As much as Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment thinkers want us to believe that the Middle Ages is this primitive, superstitious, static period, it simply isn't. Any decent survey, modern survey of the Middle Ages would convince a reader or a student that arguably European society goes through more changes in the Middle Ages than in any other period. We can argue that, I assume, but for rhetorical sake, I think I would defend that. The fall of Rome, the Germanic invasions, urbanization, the Crusades and expansion and conversion of Eastern Europe to Christianity or Northern Europe to Christianity, the trauma of the plague in 1348, the rise of kingdoms and proto-states, and then the subsequent technological changes like printing and other things, a kind of engagement with a global economy. The Middle Ages, in terms of population shifts, growth, movement, all of these things, is profoundly, profoundly dynamic, always changing. So if we know that the social context is always changing, how then do we manage or calibrate or measure the attitudes towards Jews in that world, right? That it's not a stable target, it's a moving target. If we want to talk about the nature of medieval civilization or the nature of Christianity, we can't even locate that. So if we can't locate that, how are we then going to juxtapose it to their attitudes towards Jews in any kind of productive or systematic way? So is it actually possible then to evaluate anti-Semitism or this Jewish experience in the Middle Ages in any constructive way in situ, that is about the Middle Ages itself? And I would say that it's virtually impossible to do that and be intellectually honest about it. But there's a further complication, that I think it's virtually impossible to do that about anything in the Jewish past and now because of the Holocaust. That the Holocaust casts such a shadow now over the Jewish past that it is almost impossible to treat moments in Jewish time in a not a hermetically sealed sort of way, but to separate out periods of time and not to be aware of how the Holocaust shapes, shadows, influences, distorts, leads us to certain ways of thinking about the Jewish past. And here too, this is where I think Confino and others have been so powerful, that there's something about the Holocaust that draws the Jewish past forward in time. And it's like one of those images from a science fiction show where this is probably more appropriate for my students than for you guys, but I'm hoping somebody has watched Star Trek in the past 10 or 15 years, that, where the ship gets kind of pulled and elongated as it's supposed to go into, very fast. So that, I think, is the image that seems to be happening, with the pull of the Holocaust. It kind of just reaches out and grabs the Jewish past and distorts it as we try to understand it. And anti-Semitism, or these expressions of anti-Jewish sentiment, becomes the link. It becomes the bridge by which the Holocaust reaches back into time to try to create some kind of unity or some kind of linear connection with the Jewish past. And there are advantages to that, both for Christians and Jews, to make this connection between the Holocaust and the experience of Jews in the Middle Ages. For Jews, it's a clean story, right? They always hated us. Forgive me, they're always going to hate us. It ends up in the Holocaust if we're not careful, right? And whether you're Zionist or in the diaspora, that's a nice, clean story, right? That gives you control over your identity. It gives you control over a way to understand the world, okay? It's not true. It's not healthy, but it's an effective way. It's an effective way for Jewish identity to be preserved, for the Jewish community and for Israel to maintain the boundaries around it. But it's also a convenient story for Christians in some ways, and for some Christians. That is, it's a clean explanation for the Holocaust, so that it potentially alleviates responsibility among modern Christians for the Holocaust by, again, a kind of anti-medieval, anti-pre-modern sentiment. That is, these are the things that happened before the Enlightenment. These are the things that happened before, ideals of tolerance, which we, of course, now all share. So that, for a kind of liberal Christian audience, the long duration of anti-Semitism from the medieval or ancient past to the modern period, or at least culminating in the Holocaust, is a way to kind of fence off, if you will, the complexities of the European past, makes it a very simple story, culminates in the Holocaust, horrible thing that happened, but yet we now know that after that, it couldn't happen again. We don't tolerate it. It's something that is in some ways removed from us, even if we acknowledge the pain and suffering. And certainly there are some Christians, obviously, who would, come up with different arguments, but I'm just trying to, kind of paint this very broad picture that the continuity argument about anti-Semitism to the Holocaust is something that has an appeal to both Jews and Christians in this larger sentiment. Okay. What could we do? There's no way then that thinking about the Jews in the Middle Ages or anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages is as a simple or easy activity, right? I hope I've, at least up to this point, demonstrated that it is almost paralyzingly complicated and in some ways undermines some of our basic assumptions about how history looks. However, I think that, and this is where I kind of woke up to a different way of thinking about this, that the Holocaust and work on the Holocaust can help us see some aspects of the medieval Jewish experience that we had not thought about in quite the same way, or at least I had not thought about in quite the same way. One of the things that was so striking about Alon Confino's work on the Holocaust is his description of this Nazi fantasy or this Nazi ideology, this, a kind of religious vision that the Nazis had of a world without Jews. That's what they fundamentally wanted. They wanted a world without Jews. And that's combined with the work, I think, of his teacher, Avi can correct me if I'm wrong, Saul Friedlander, who talked about the redemptive anti-Semitism of the Nazis. That the Nazis thought that by eliminating the Jews, they were creating the world de novo. That is, they were creating a new world that was free of all of the corruption of Judaism and of the Jews. No more liberalism, no more Weimar Republic, no more superstition. That is, it was a redemptive, apocalyptic anti-Semitism where the world begins again on the racial model of Germanness, Germantum, I guess, Deutschtum. So these two ideas, a vision of a world without Jews and of a redemptive anti-Semitism, is those two poles, those two lenses are very, very powerful, I think, ways of understanding what motivated certainly the elite, and as it percolated down into German culture, the vast majority of Germans and many other Europeans who bought into this as well. Now, okay, what does that have to do with the Middle Ages? Normally, I would have said nothing. And, and that's why you study the Middle Ages, because they at least weren't insane, right? They believed in strange things in the Middle Ages, but they weren't insane. Whereas, this redemptive fantasy of the Nazis, clearly is insanity. However, this modern Nazi anti-Semitism, deeply filled with the racial, sensibility and animosity towards the Jews, is there are some echoes from the medieval past. It makes me uncomfortable to say it, but there are some echoes in the way medieval Christians thought about and treated the Jews that can be seen in some way, we'll have to talk about exactly how, as either foreshadowings or in some way expressions of a fantasy or a world without Jews, okay? It may have meant something very different to medieval Christians than it did to Nazis. I certainly hope so. I think so. But to be intellectually honest, we have to recognize that not static, I'm looking for a different electrical metaphor. We have to recognize that, kind of entanglement, that sort of interconnection before we dismiss it. What is conversion after all? I mean, the idea of converting the Jews, which Christians hoped to do, despite Augustine, embedded in Augustine's ideal that Dina talked about in the first session as being witnesses to the authenticity and antiquity of Scripture, of being an example of God's punishment but mercy. At the end, the Jews would convert, and that would seal the deal. That would demonstrate that Christ was truly the Savior, and this was the true path to salvation. If that works, it's a world without Jews. It doesn't efface the memory of Judaism. And again, that may be one way in which we can begin to distinguish the difference between this medieval environment and the Nazi environment. But it certainly creates a world without Jews. Certainly, the episodes of expulsion of Jews from England, 1290, from France at different points in the 13th and early 14th century, from parts of from parts of Italy, depending upon who was running things, from various German cities and principalities in the 14th and 15th century. Those expulsions definitely seem to express the desire on the part of some people, not just the elites, but on some people to have a world without Jews. Certainly some of the attacks on Jewish communities at various points in the Rhineland in 1099, during 1098, 1097, 1098, the Rhineland attacks against the Jewish communities during the First Crusade, the various sort of outbursts against the Jews during later crusades, the 1391 attacks in Spain against the Jewish communities there, probably also can be understood as expressions, as very violent expressions of the desire to create a world or a locality or a principality or a kingdom without Jews. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that? I would have said previously, we ignore it, or we try to explain it away. I'm not sure we can do that anymore. I'm not sure I want to do that. I do think it can be refined so that there are distinctions between a medieval vision of a world without Jews and a modern Nazi vision of a world without Jews. For example, it doesn't seem to be that the motivation to, in this world with this medieval world without Jews, is not linked to a sense that they were trying to create the world de novo, that they were trying to create a radically new world, right? The genocidal impulse of the Nazis was to create a radically new and different world. The impulse of these people, if we're accurate in seeing this as an impulse to create a world without Jews in these situations, seems to me to be more about kind of fine-tuning a world that's already functioning perfectly fine, right? Christianity is dominant, we're on the road to salvation, we're just kind of cleaning up, basically, these Jewish communities. So it's not as radically a revolutionary or creative, I'm using the word creative not in an approving kind of way. It's not a kind of creative, it's not a kind of Genesis act in the same way that it was for the Nazis. Does that make a difference? Does that rationalize it? Does that explain it away? I'm not sure, but I do think there is some difference still between these two attempts to create worlds without Jews. Okay, I do write a little bit more about this. Again, Zoom seems to be about self-promotion. If you want to follow up on this idea about these kind of the use of genocide or the ideas of genocide in modern Europe compared to genocide or what we think might be a genocide in the medieval past, I have a little article coming out next year in an encyclopedia about the Holocaust. I can send Avi the proofs so that he can distribute that to people. And some of what I've just talked about in terms of the way genocidal thinking is different in the medieval past. It's a very interesting story in itself about why medieval historians use or don't use the word genocide. That's something that people can follow up on if they're interested in. Okay. Are there other links to the medieval context between the Holocaust, modern Nazi, redemptive anti-Semitism, and the Middle Ages that we have to confront rather than explain away? And I think there are, at least there are a few that we have to talk about. One is, again, going back to Confino's work, that I think we have to acknowledge the long-term preparation and context for the Holocaust. We can't, and again, I think I'm stepping on Avi's toes. He'll correct me during his session, or we can have this conversation, that from my reading of Confino's synthesis of the historiography, he's suggesting that there is a way in which the actual understanding of the motivations for the Holocaust have been, for a variety of reasons, kind of narrowed, and the time frame has shortened. The time frame has been compressed. But if you look at more recent historians, Confino, others, who will say, look, you really can't understand the Holocaust that way. You have to see it in the context of 19th century European colonialism, not just the Germans in Africa, where they did horrible things to various African peoples, but also the way the British and the French and others, the Belgians, treated primitive people, not primitive, people, African peoples, so that Confino and others have opened up the time frame for us in a way that is problematic. If we're going to understand the Holocaust and Nazi redemptive anti-Semitism against a background that now is not just simply 1933 to 1939 and then to 1945, but rather it really goes back into the 19th century, First World War, the barbarity, the destruction of the First World War, 19th century colonialism. When do we stop, right? At what point does it no longer become context, or at what point does the attitudes towards Judaism no longer become a relevant context for what happens in the Holocaust? And Confino's work and others, Smith, other people, who talk about sort of Christian attitudes in 19th century Germany and elsewhere, it's very suggestive that many of the sort of the soil for Christian passivity or engagement with the Nazis in Germany was set deep, was tilled very, very deeply and very, very early, in 19th century Germany and Europe. One might even say, and this is again something it'd be fun to talk with Avi and Dina about, that there's a way in which this might all be a kind of post-Enlightenment trauma. That is, people are still looking for salvation, still looking for meaning of the world. And certainly after the Enlightenment, that becomes very difficult to do solely in religious terms. So they begin to substitute these other fantasies for making meaning of their life and of their society. But for our purposes, if you open the door to a context going back to the 19th century, do you step through that door and go back to the 17th century? Do you go back to the 16th century? Do you go back to the Middle Ages? Normally, I would have said no, right? Stay out of the Middle Ages. Just focus on 1933 forward. But I've been persuaded, or at least seduced, into thinking that we really have to think in much more longer terms, maybe post-Enlightenment, maybe even before that, to really understand what attitudes towards religion, what attitudes towards race, what attitudes towards the Jews grew up over time. Now, that doesn't take into account how you measure those things, right? how you transmit that from generation to generation. So issues of calibration, issues of measurement, issues of assessment, still huge question marks around there. It's just a question, but it raises the issue where there's some intellectual pressure now not to treat the Holocaust as this kind of hermetically sealed event that exists outside of time and outside of any kind of connection with European religious culture from the medieval past. Okay. All right. Last question. Does finally then the language about anti-Semitism offer us some way to better understand the reality of the Jewish experience and attitudes towards the Jews? I would say that it does, but we have to be careful. There are ways in which the argument or the study of the Holocaust is kind of insidious. Just one example. You've probably all noticed, right, that oftentimes the language about anti-Semitism is couched in a biological or medical terminology, right? Anti-Semitism is a virus, it mutates. I mean, you could look at any ADL newsletter, right? And there's going to be something there. So what does that sound like? That sounds very much like the language of the Nazis about the Jews themselves, right? That they're a virus, they're a biological threat, they change, they mutate, they transfer, you know, so they're a plague, et cetera, et cetera. So that the emotional power kind of and the intellectual force of the Holocaust and trying to sort of deal with all of those images, all of that language can infect our own understanding of the past in a way which I think is potentially very dangerous. So we have to be very careful. But that being said, it is inescapable that some Christians at different times through the European past have imagined a world without Jews. And that is a question that we have to do better to understand. We don't have to call it anti-Semitism, we don't have to call it anti-Judaism, and we don't have to necessarily believe that there is a direct line from that thinking to the Holocaust. But we do have to study it. And I think I wasn't prepared to do that before because I was trying to kind of defend the Middle Ages from the insanity of the modern world. But I think I'm willing to admit my mistake. I'm going to go to a 12-step program of, you know, better ways to understand the Middle Ages. And I think that this conversation for me, or at least, you know, trying to prepare this for me was very helpful. And I hope I have conveyed some of that struggle and some of those questions to you guys, and I'll stop.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. And you raised so many points, which I'm taking notes as you're speaking, because I think there are things that you and Dina and I will discuss on November 9th. I mean, about these continuities and discontinuities. I do want to remind everyone as I'm talking that if you have questions that have come up for Jonathan, to please either type them into the chat or feel free to, probably easiest if you type into the chat, even if you say, I have a question, and then I'll call on you. That way we're not all talking at the same time for Jonathan, and we can sort of handle the discussion in that way. So I don't know if anyone has a question yet. I can, let me switch over to gallery mode. You can also raise your hands if you have a question to start with. I see Adam Sherry, one of my former students at the University of Hartford. I'm really happy that you're here joining us for the class. So please go ahead, Adam. Why don't you start us off?
So thank you, Dr. Pat, and I'm really glad to be here. So Dr. Elukin, to what extent do you believe that the internet's enabling of anti-Semitism's greater dissemination greater dissemination mirrors the pan-European spread of anti-Jewish hatred that stemmed from the emergence of print culture?
I think it's a great question, and certainly my little digression on Magna Teeter's work on printing, is meant to allude to the fact that, maybe the internet is another one of these sort of technological shifts that, again, re-embeds or reanimates anti-Semitism in quite dangerous ways. But I will punt the rest of that answer to Avi or Dina, either now or in the next session, as we talk about the contemporary world, because I certainly am not an expert on that. Is Gary has his hand up? Do you want to opine about this?
No, I want to ask a different question.
Okay, well, maybe Avi, do you want to talk about the internet briefly?
So I'd love to not talk about the internet. No, I'll just say that I think Adam's question is a good one in terms of sort of, and as you suggested, in terms of Magda's book, which I have a copy of here. It's about 1,000 pages, and I have not cracked it open yet. But I do think that there's one of the things that's interesting, and as Jonathan's talk was alluding to, the ways in which we take our sort of knowledge of the modern period and apply it backwards, and our understanding of the way that knowledge spreads is interesting. I mean, one of the things that Jonathan was talking a lot about is, to what extent do we have the benefit of hindsight, and do we begin to look backwards? And I think a lot of medieval historians were very much on guard against that, right? That we shouldn't engage in teleology, and just because we know that European Jewry is going to be destroyed, we shouldn't be looking for the seeds of that destruction. At the same time, Jonathan's mea culpa suggests that maybe there are some things that we should have been looking for that we weren't looking for yet, and just to sort of reject it all entirely is not also the best approach. I'll reserve judgment on that and maybe talk about it more next week, because I think we have to be careful with that. With the internet, I'm really interested. So I mentioned this conference that the State Department is doing. One of the things that I'll be looking for, and we can talk about this more next week, is to what extent do we see these medieval tropes of what we're calling, and we'll discuss this, I'm sure. I know there are questions about what's the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, or sort of Jewish sentiment and anti-Semitism. But to what extent does the internet just help more easily proliferate these medieval tropes than they ever could have before, which might be, to Adam's question, the use of a modern technology. It's just more efficient at speedily spreading these ideas than the printed book was. Or I'm going to talk next week about Nazi propaganda posters, right? But you would have to either see a book or see a newspaper or see a poster in the street to see those. And now you can use Twitter to spread those even more quickly. So we'll talk about that maybe a little more next week.
I mean, I could just add one thing. I mean, I also do think it raises some interesting questions about sort of the definition of knowledge, or the authority of knowledge, right? That is, how do people in different societies accept and evaluate information, right? That is, in a marginally literate 14th century world, the appearance of a book might have been a transformative kind of experience for somebody, right? It really might have embedded, impacted their mind with this material because they had never seen it before. I don't know, I think there are studies being done about the impact on our wiring from Twitter and the internet and Instagram and all these other things, not just about the content, right? But about the mechanism, the biological and kind of psychological impact of the content, which I'm sure there will be dissertations written about, right? So that it may not just be it may just not be a simple question of a technological change that increases the amount of the stuff. That was basically Eisenstein's argument. There's just more of this stuff, they can't get rid of it, so it becomes embedded in the culture. It might be something more insidious, that it's not just more stuff, but the way the stuff is transmitted is, zapping and wiring our brains in a particularly dangerous kind of way. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to pose the question to Jonathan. You know, if you talk about these middle-aged tropes that then start coming down into the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, aren't those the seeds of acceptance for those who were fellow travelers, if you will, of the Nazis? The people who just sort of didn't join the party, but didn't take any action against it, because they had already been inculcated with this idea either of Jewish conversion is necessary for salvation, ultimately.
Yeah, you know, you've asked sort of the key question here. And on one hand, right, on one hand, that is a very attractive explanation, right? That Christianity, this sort of salvational model, a kind of world without Jews, that, as you say, kind of seeds the ground or inculcates or prepares people for the redemptive version that they get from the Nazis. You know, my instinct says that for some people, that probably was true. But it's very hard to make a systematic analysis of that, right? Because belief, necessarily after the Enlightenment into the 19th and then into the 20th century, I mean, Europe changes so dramatically. You know, the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, the state, all of these traumas, all of these huge reorientations of human life and human society. That is, it seems implausible to me that this one thread about the Jews would survive untouched or unaffected, you know, to sort of lay dormant and then reappear when it's watered by the Nazi insanity.
Let me pose it.
My response would be, yeah, go ahead.
All right, so let's look at Spain, because Spain, the Jews of Spain were either expelled or required to convert, and yet the conversos were still hunted down. And even after all of that, anti-Semitism remained in Spain without Jews.
Okay, but again, you know, we want to be careful about the terminology, right? Here, so let's not talk about Spain for a second. Okay, let's stay on Germany and we'll bracket Spain for a second. Your initial point is why I'm struggling with this. That is, that's a clean story, right? You just gave us a very compelling and clean narrative that helps explain essentially the radicalization of the German and then of the, you know, other European populations that supported the Nazis, that they were psychologically, emotionally prepared to accept the kind of extreme redemptive anti-Semitism of the Nazis because Christianity in some way had prepared them to accept the reasonableness, right? The possible reality of, and the desirable reality of a world without Jews. Again, that's very clean and very seductive. But my counter to that is not that I'm dismissing it out of hand or not that I think we shouldn't consider it, but that we really, if we're going to make that case, we have to make it in the context of how complicated European society was and how complicated European Christianity was. And once you start to do that, sort of that clean through line, that clean story, you know, becomes very, very messy, right? What do you do about the increasing majority of the population by the 19th century in many countries of Europe that didn't believe in Christ, in Jesus anymore, or didn't attend church, or was ambivalent when they went to church, didn't necessarily have firm theological convictions, right? What do you do about if you're going to rest an argument on the capacity of religion to motivate and shape people's minds? How do you make that case in a post-Enlightenment Europe, right? Where religion had taken a body blow, not have been destroyed, and there's a counter-Enlightenment that reasserts religion's power. But it's not as if you're talking about a completely neutral or understandable terrain. It's very, very complicated terrain. So I agree with you in some kind of intuitive way, or I think that in some ways what Confino and others are arguing, that this is a kind of intuitive connection that has to be made, that can't be discounted. But at the same time, it has to be done so carefully and so with a very wide lens, that we can't just go to it as an automatic explanation, because then you're just reverting to, you know, the Holocaust was caused by Christian anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll accept for discussion purposes. The interconnection between all the other dynamics going on in Europe, but it's almost as if this is even with taking those other impacts, the change in the Industrial Revolution, the fears of communism, the economic competitiveness. The fact is that there's this still underlying acceptance of the trope that we don't want the Jews around. And
yeah, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. One of the things that's so striking to me about the resurgence of anti-Semitism now, even after the Holocaust, is it makes it very hard to understand human beings and human society, right? That is, on the one hand, humanity has lived through, you know, complete reorientations in the way we understand ourselves and the world. You know, the first scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution of the heliocentric vision of the world as opposed to the Earth-centric view of the world. We've lived through Darwin and the evolutionary model as opposed to the, you know, revelation and God's creation. You know, not even counting Spinoza and the rejection of the holiness of the biblical text itself. You know, we've lived through space flight, we've lived through nuclear energy and nuclear war. We've lived through these unbelievably traumatic shifts in the way we understand ourselves as human beings, as the way we understand our place in the galaxy, in the universe, the expansiveness of the galaxy, right? In a way that you can't even figure out where we fit into this immense space. And yet, there seem to be some people who are still occupied with creating a world without Jews. That to me is one of the profound issues here. That is, can't you think about something else? Why are you not thinking about something else, right? Pick any of these other things to think about.
It's comprehensible.
Lots of things are comprehensible.
Big Bang is incomprehensible. I'm sorry.
So you want to think about a world without Jews? I mean,
well,
I'm going to jump in.
I'm usurping the time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I know that I see that Dina had a comment or a question, and Anne has her hand up as well. And I also want to, so why don't we let Dina and then Anne, and then I do want to circle back to the bracketed off Spain conversation, which I think is important too.
I wasn't trying to avoid it. It was complicating the interaction, the interchange.
But why don't we let Dina go, and then we'll do Anne, and then maybe we'll come back to Spain.
I simply just wrote it on my on the comments, something that I thought about as you were speaking, and so a little while ago. So now I'm forgetting what I had thought about.
You want me to read it out? The focus on Jewish facial features among the Nazis reminds me of Christian theologians who sometimes suggested that conversion baptism doesn't actually work. Jews' circumcision, absence of foreskin, even male menstruation would remain because the cleansing waters of baptism didn't clean enough. Basically, their problematic outsides reflected their hard-headed inside. Yes.
It was just something that reminded me of Middle Ages and then Nazi, the phrenology. And...
Yes, absolutely. There's no getting away from the fact that, and I think this isn't unique. Again, this may sound like a rationalization or trying to explain it away, but I think it's actually contextualizing it. That, there's no getting away from the fact that, human beings define each other in terms of their physical characteristics, right? And again, in the ancient world and in the medieval world, different groups did that. It wasn't just Christians looking at the facial features of Jews, or, it was, human beings do this, right? Now, whether that's racism or not is a separate discussion. But it's certainly a kind of profoundly human way of marking differences between in-groups and out-groups. And certainly some Christians did it, but I think that they were a very small group. Their particular positions or their particular ideas got stuck into and were preserved in some of these manuscripts and artworks and things like that. But again, going back to my initial sort of survey of the issue between the negative trope stories and the positive reality, if you look at the relations between Christians and Jews outside of those theological disputes or some of those theological accusations that you cite here, generally speaking, I think that they didn't have a particularly racial or physical response to the Jews. Certainly not anything more than any other in or out group would have had to each other. Now, that being said, it's certainly true that post-Enlightenment Christians, and certainly Christians who began to think in racial terms, could see in that language from the ancient, late antiquity and the medieval past, a kind of Christian subsidizing, a kind of Christian support, theological support for their racial ideas of the 19th and 20th century. So I wouldn't discount it. I would just say, as a reflection of the medieval reality, I think it was relatively marginal.
Right. So I kind of, we read the winners, the writings of the winners.
Right.
I would also say the Nazis were marginal in the larger humanity, but it's an explanation of,
I'm not sure. I mean, I would let Avi answer that. I'm not sure the Nazis were so marginal in the 20th century. I mean, they were, it looked like they were going to win for a long time. So I'm not sure I would think about them as marginal. Sorry, somebody else had their hand up, Avi. Did you?
Yeah, Anne, I think you have your hand up to follow. Yeah.
Going back to medieval, the medieval period, and how Jews were viewed, you were talking about whether or not society, Christian society, wanted a world without Jews. I always think of it more not that they wanted a world without Jews, although Jews certainly were expelled from certain places, but more that the Jews were always there and should always be there and not done away with, so that they could be the best scapegoat. So that when something went awry, they were, it seems, often chosen to be the group to get the blame and to be able to be the group that was punished, blamed and then punished for things that happened, and needed to be there for Christians, so Christians could point to the Jews and say, this is what happens when you don't accept Jesus as the Lord. How does that fit into what you've been saying?
Well, I think it's part of it. Again, you know, there's not necessarily a binary yes or no to some of these issues. Certainly, not every Christian in the Middle Ages imagined or actively imagined or wanted a world without Jews. My point was that we see a kind of troubling echo or foreshadowing in medieval terms of this Nazi redemptive vision. And we see it in moments of conversion, preaching about conversion or pressure on communities to convert. We see it in some of the violence against local Jewish communities. We see it in some of the moments of expulsion from England, from France, and elsewhere. So that, and there were certainly other motivations for those actions, right? You can understand those events in other terms or as having other pressures or levers that cause them. The expulsion can be understood in the terms of royal governments that want to extract as much wealth from a Jewish community. Once they do that, they're no longer important to the crown, and just get them out because they're causing problems. The nobility doesn't like them, and there are various other issues. Better just to get the money and get them out. Local violence against the Jews can be explained not just in terms of a world without Jews, but it can be explained in terms of class conflict. Certainly in the 14th century, a lot of the urban attacks on the Jews clearly come out of a sense on the part of a kind of lower middle class, lower class, artisanal or laboring population that wants to attack the Jews because they're of a higher status and have more disposable or visible wealth. The conversionary efforts can be explained, not just out of this vision of a world without Jews, but again, out of Christian concerns about theological arguments, how the Jews fit into their particular theology. So that there are always multiple ways to understand this. And I just wanted to signal that some aspects of these events, these negative Jewish events, had this disturbing kind of entanglement with the redemptive anti-Semitism and Nazi fantasies that became, very dominant, right? Which became, animated the Nazi state and Nazi society in really very bizarre ways. In terms of the scapegoat argument, yes, obviously the Jews were used as a scapegoat in certain scenarios. The plague thing comes to mind, that the attacks on the Jews because of the plague, or the attacks on the Jews because things were going badly in the Crusades. But the problem with making the scapegoat such a structural and permanent part of the explanatory model is that there weren't always Jews in every community where bad things happened. They were also very willing to get rid of the Jews, even though they knew bad things were going to happen and needed a scapegoat. So that, it's not a logically defensible kind of claim to say that the Jews played this role as a scapegoat, so they must have been preserved, or that was the primary goal, that was the primary role that they played in this society. I think the scapegoating of the Jews was contingency, that when they were there, when other things aligned, you could turn to and blame the Jews. It didn't always happen, right? Not every Jewish community was attacked after 1348. Many were protected. Not every Jewish community was accused of blood libel or ritual murder. Many were protected by kings, etc. Not every Jewish community was attacked during the Crusades. Many of them were protected by bishops and local friends and other people. So it's part of the explanation, just as these other things are part of the explanation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I know that Joel is going to have a question, and I'm going to
Yes,
turn to him
he
in a
emailed
moment.
me the question
Yeah.
before I even started to talk.
But before I turn it over to Joel with his question, I do want to follow up on the point that Gary raised about Spain, because I do think it's something important to address in this conversation, and I think it actually connects somewhat with one of Dina's points, which is that conversion, right? Conversion wouldn't necessarily solve something intrinsic about that the Jews had that you couldn't get rid of, which I don't know. And you can address this. You know, is it right to use racial terminology when we talk about sort of this the Spanish problem? Because the solution then is expulsion, right? So you're not keeping the Jews around for scapegoating. You're giving up on conversion, and the only solution is to expel both the Jews and those fake new Christians who are still essentially Jews. So how do we work that into this understanding of you know, anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages?
No, I mean, look, I mean, you know, I avoided the question when Gary asked me because I was sort of stalling. You know, I was trying to buy myself some time. And I think that it's a very legitimate problem. I mean, the Spanish story is very complicated. You know, again, the argument is, the explanation has many aspects to it. The one that I think is compelling is that, you know, there was a lot of pressure on the Spanish kingdom in 1492. They had just obviously completed the Reconquista, that was the retaking of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims with the conquest of Granada. So that there seemed to have been in 1492 a sense of completeness, that the Christianizing, you know, Hispanicizing process was reaching a culminating point, that we were going to get back Spain from the Muslims finally. So you do that and you turn around and you see, well, not just that we have a population of conquered Muslims who also create other problems. And one of the things that's obviously missing from this whole enterprise is, you know, comparative discussion of Jews under Islam, you know, also a monotheistic and scriptural religion that reacts to the Jews very differently, that does not seem to embrace a fantasy of a world without Jews, either in its medieval context or even at its worst modern expressions, you know, seems to be somehow a little qualitatively different than, you know, the Nazi fantasy. But you turn around after completing the Reconquista and you see that, hey, we still have this population of Jews. They haven't gotten the message. They're still, you know, they're still not on board with this Christian Iberian sort of model that we're creating. The other problem is that an active Jewish community is perceived as a kind of temptation to the conversos, to the population that converted after 1391 and their descendants, because the Jews are seen as still trying to preserve these family attachments and to draw the conversos back to Judaism. So the drive for expulsion may not simply be a kind of outburst of racial animosity towards the Jews, but it may be a kind of policy decision that is, we want to protect and ensure the survival of the conversos so that they don't apostatize. Let's get rid of the Jewish communities that still exist. You know, it also doesn't fit with this Reconquista model that we have in our minds. It's just easier to get the Jews out. Now, that being said, it is still a world without Jews, right? It still creates a world without Jews, or at least a world without visible Jews. Now, for a whole variety of reasons, as Gary, you know, points out rightly, and you've obviously just talked about too, there is a kind of shift or a kind of racial turn in Spanish thinking about Judaism. I would say that it is not, again, you were talking about sort of reading back into the past, our contemporary assumptions. I don't think that we can simply understand it as suddenly, the Spaniards woke up in 1450, in sort of 1500, and decided to be racist or to think like the Nazis. Medieval society had, for generations, for multiple hundreds of years, thought in terms of lineage, right? Who was noble, who was not noble, who was a peasant, who was servile, who was English, who was French. So that ideas about lineage, ideas about racial lineage, ideas about blood connections, marriage, bastardy, all these things, was part of medieval society. I don't think that the Spanish were being so precocially racist or racialist in that way. I think that all of these ideas about lineage came together because of this particular problem that they were confronting. They just got rid of the Jews to save the conversos. They had to deal with a visible population of Muslims that they had conquered. They were trying to kind of purify and Christianize Iberia. And they remembered that, oh yeah, we have this huge population, significant population of Jews who also converted, right? How Christian are they? How, in the same way that they would think about how noble is the merchant who married the noble's daughter, right? How noble is that are those children? So I think there's an element of contingency here, an element that this happened in Spain because of these factors, where it took other European societies much longer, and not really until the modern period, to think more exclusively in racial terms.
Thank you. That's helpful. And
it may not be true, but it's helpful.
Yeah. No, and I think contingency is really, really sort of the key word here, right? That as you've been pointing to, there's so many factors that we have to take into consideration that it's hard to make sort of these blanket generalizations.
Yeah.
Joel, I know Joel has been waiting patiently. Go ahead, Joel.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you, Avi, and thanks, Jonathan. I am sometimes accused of being too formalistic with the language, too concerned about language, too linguistic, too concerned about semantics. But I have to say that semantics are important because words bear meaning. And having read Jonathan's essay, which I really liked, and anticipating that he would speak about language and nomenclature, I wrote a note to Jonathan, finally expressing myself in writing, not so much to ask a question, although I would like to have Jonathan's and anyone else's reactions to this, but to finally express my objection to the term anti-Semitism. For several reasons. Two of them are formal reasons, and them are, to me, more important substantive reasons, or even moral reasons. So I'm just going to quickly read the note that I wrote to Jonathan, which I copied also to Regina, Avi, and so indeed, I said I oppose the established use of the term anti-Semitism to denote beliefs, feelings, and manifestations of antipathy toward Jews for four reasons. One, as a formal matter, the term anti-Semitism in this context is literally incorrect. I mean, we said this in our description. It's a misnomer. The logical root, Semite, denotes a class of peoples that includes, but is broader, I think probably broader than just Jews. Second formal point is that as a linguistic matter, there's no context that I know of other than anti-Jewish antipathy in which the terms Semitic and Semitism are commonly used regarding Jews. So why do we use it in anti-Semitism? And now I'd like to go on to two more important points, one being a moral and the other being a really symbolic point. As a moral matter, I believe that Jews should not use a term for anti-Jewish antipathy that was created by anti-Jewish sources for anti-Jewish purposes. Rather, in my view, Jews should create their own particular term to describe beliefs, feelings, and manifestation of antipathy toward Jews. And I suggested the term anti-Jewism. Let's be front and center about it. As an aesthetic, semantic, and symbolic matter, the term anti-Semitism is euphemistic. It's a euphemism. because it avoids the root word Jew. And in my view, Jews should not use a mere euphemism to denote anti-Jewish antipathy. Rather, in my view, Jews should create and use a term to denote beliefs, feelings, and manifestations of antipathy toward Jews that intentionally includes and focuses upon the root word Jew, such as the expression, the term anti-Jewism. I don't like euphemisms. I think euphemisms are avoidance mechanisms, and I think it's unfortunately historically lamentable, that word should be pronounced, that we Jews have adopted a term created in 1879 or so by Austrian and Jew haters.
All right, so Jonathan, do you want to, I'll talk next week about Wilhelm Marr and the origins of the term anti-Semitism, but what do you think about sort of, retroactively applying this term that's really a modern, it's sort of very, very close to what you're talking about, because it's a modern formulation to organize, a group of people around shared anti-Jewish antipathy. Is it a complete anachronism to use the term and morally incorrect to use the term?
Well, I think I agree with Joel on both of those points. I mean, both for the semantic reasons and for the moral reasons. I think the problem is not so much whether we pick Semitism, Judaism, Jewism, or Judaism, or Israelitism, or whatever term we pick to describe the collectivity of Jews. I think the problem is with the anti, because the anti reduces this, and this is my other little piece from Toronto, the anti reduces a whole range of complicated reactions to the Jews that range from, obsessive, fantastical hatred and fantasies to philo-Semitic, pro-Jewish engagement. It conflates all of that into anti. And it's not all anti of the same level or the same degree in the same place at the same time. So I would extend your comment or argument to say that this binary of anti-X against the Jews is not helpful at all to understand the very complicated reality of Christian-Jewish interaction.
So let's fix both sides of the hyphen.
Yeah.
At the same time, I mean, do we call it the hatred that cannot be named, right? There's...
Right. I mean, I'm getting to the point where I don't know how to talk about the subject. Like, it's as soon as you start talking about it, you are creating assumptions and value judgments and parameters about the issue that I don't think are legitimate, right? That aren't useful. So how do you talk about something that by the very act of naming or talking about it, it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? As soon as you try to study it, you've distorted it.
Agreed. And I have to confess that when we first proposed this course a year ago, I was conflicted about what to call it. I would have preferred not to call it anti-Semitism, but how else would we have introduced it? And that would have, involved the whole discussion about what would have gotten involved in this very issue.
Right. And what is very interesting, again, a subject for another paper, is there another subject, is there another issue that creates the same kind of problems? I don't think, I mean, maybe the closest you could come is racism, but I'm not even sure that racism is subject to the same sort of strains and stresses that anti-Semitism is subjected to, in the way that we've been talking about it. So there is something rather unique intellectually about this thing that we're calling anti-Semitism. I don't know if there is another sort of intellectual construct that is subject to the same kind of problems as anti-Semitism. Again, that would be an interesting subject to discuss further.
I mean, I think one of the challenges that we're pointing out is there's so many discontinuities between what we're describing in the ancient, the medieval, and the modern period that we can't even come up with one term to refer to all those different things. And then, and I'll talk about this next week, when we look at anti-Semitism in the modern period, sorry, Joel, I have to use a term, but when we look at it in the modern period, there's so many different forms of it. Even in the present day, right? Jonathan and I were looking at this internet, manifestations of online anti-Semitism in the world today. And we're very sure, looking at the schedule, which I will send to everyone, that there are very specific forms of anti-Semitism flourishing here in the United States today, which we will call domestic terrorism or the white nationalist movement, that they're not going to talk about. But they'll very happily talk about forms of anti-Zionism or Holocaust denial, or, so.
Anti-Semitism, yeah.
What's that?
Or Islamic anti-Semitism.
Right. So, and even if we look at in the world today, or when I next week talk about 19th century, 20th century, anti-Semitism in France was different from anti-Semitism in Russia, was different from anti-Semitism in Germany, was different from Poland. So how useful is it? Because we're going to talk about, the only thing unites it is a hatred of Jews or Jewish people, but it performs many different functions in many different places. So maybe it tells us more about the place and what it's being used for. The Jews are almost secondary and irrelevant to it. It's more about the hatred and what it's being used for in the place that it's being used.
Which again, in an interesting and kind of ironic way, brings us back to a religious way of thinking about the Jews, right? That the Jews become a tool for Christians to express their own needs and their own anxieties, which is certainly something that Dina talked about in, the ancient period. So that, that part of the experience is something that we can't ignore. That we might be trapped in this kind of religious loop, or this, structural loop that Judaism gets used by Christianity in these ways.
All right, this is all very, very interesting, and I think.
Right, did I have crazy eyes and did I yell at people, or was it okay?
No, you're great.
It was okay.
Great. Yes. So,
right.
And I think this sets us up well to continue this conversation next week, because you made so many connections between the modern period, and I'm going to try to complicate some of those, the sort of, for the exact reasons that you pointed out, why it's difficult to look backwards, and sort of the ways in which it complicates our understanding of how this hatred that we have assigned the name anti-Semitism to functions in the modern period. I mean, there is something about, I'm thinking about Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities. So when Adam was asking about anti-Semitism online, what it really does is it helps bring together all these people and say, oh yeah, I have a shared, community of fellow travelers who hate Jews just like I do, and Jews are irrelevant to that. So we'll talk about this some more. So I'm going to send you more food for thought for next week. We'll discuss some of the sources and we'll look at some of the sources together, and we'll probably have conversations that go all the way back from the ancient to the medieval to the modern. Let's give Jonathan a Zoom round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So this was great. Thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks for sticking with it. I know that it went on for a while, so I appreciate your patience, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you.
Great. Everybody be well, stay healthy.
Okay, yeah. Well, stay safe. Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Good night.
Good night.